Elizabeth I issued one final command. No one could ever examine her body. Not the royal physicians, not the embalmers, not anyone. Within hours, her corpse was sealed inside a lead coffin, so fast that Tudor officials broke protocol. What was she hiding beneath those elaborate dresses and white makeup? By the end of this video, you'll understand why the truth had to be buried with her forever. March 24th, 1603. Richmond Palace. The most powerful woman in Europe lay dying, and her final words weren't about God, her kingdom, or her legacy. Elizabeth I summoned her most trusted advisors to her bedside and issued a command that would echo through history as one of the strangest royal decrees ever recorded. According to the account of Robert Cecil, who was present in the death chamber, the Queen gripped the bedsheets with surprising strength for someone so close to death and whispered a prohibition that made everyone in the room exchange nervous glances. No autopsy, no embalming, no examination of her body whatsoever. This wasn't a request. It was an order backed by royal authority, and anyone who violated it would face severe consequences. But here's what makes this truly bizarre. Every English monarch before her had undergone post-mortem examination. It was standard protocol, documented procedure, expected practice. Henry VIII, her father, had been autopsied and embalmed over several days. Edward VI, her half-brother, underwent medical examination. Even Mary I, her Catholic half-sister who hated her, had allowed physicians to inspect her body after death. So why would Elizabeth, who had controlled her image so masterfully for 45 years, suddenly become paranoid about what happened after she couldn't control anything anymore? The historical record preserved in the state papers of the reign shows something peculiar about those final hours. Lady Scrope, one of Elizabeth's closest attendants, wrote in a letter dated March 25th that the Queen spoke with a vehemence unusual for one so weakened by illness when giving this command. Dr. John Dee, the Queen's personal astrologer and scientific advisor, noted in his private journals, now housed in the British Library, that he was specifically barred from the death chamber during the final 24 hours, which was unprecedented. Dee had attended the Queen during previous illnesses and had been present at countless court events, yet suddenly he was excluded. Even more suspicious, the royal physicians who had treated Elizabeth throughout her final illness, Dr. Roger Lopez's successor and the consulting physicians from the College of Physicians of London, were dismissed before her actual death. The official explanation was that the Queen wanted privacy and dignity in her final moments, surrounded only by her ladies-in-waiting and closest political advisors. But medical historians have pointed out a glaring inconsistency. If she was concerned about dignity, why not simply request a private examination after death? Why ban all medical inspection entirely? The answer, according to forensic analysis of the political situation, suggests she was protecting a secret that would have destroyed not just her reputation, but the entire foundation of Tudor legitimacy. What makes Elizabeth's prohibition even more fascinating is the language she used, according to court records. She didn't say, "I prefer not to be examined," or "I wish for a simple burial." The phrasing documented in the Privy Council minutes was absolute and legally binding. Upon pain of our royal displeasure and potential charges of treason, no person shall open, examine, or disturb our royal person after death. Treason. That's the charge reserved for threats to the crown itself, for rebellion, for conspiracy against the state. Why would a post-mortem medical examination constitute treason unless there was something about her physical body that could delegitimize the entire monarchy? Contemporary legal scholar Sir Edward Coke, who would later become Lord Chief Justice, privately questioned this decree in his personal papers, calling it a most unusual safeguard, suggesting concealment of matters touching the realm's foundation. The Queen's terror wasn't about vanity or squeamishness. She had watched executions, survived smallpox that left her face scarred beneath the white lead makeup, lived through assassination attempts. This was calculated political strategy extending beyond the grave. And what the Tudor establishment did in the hours after her death proves they understood exactly what she was protecting. The speed was everything. Historical accounts from multiple sources, the Venetian ambassador's dispatch, the Spanish embassy's encrypted report to Philip III, and the personal diary of Lady Southwell all confirm the same shocking timeline. Elizabeth I died at approximately 3 in the morning on March 24th, 1603. By noon that same day, her body was already enclosed in a lead coffin that had been soldered shut. 9 hours. For context, when Henry VIII died in 1547, his body lay in state for 2 weeks before the funeral, during which time it was embalmed, examined, and prepared according to elaborate royal protocol documented in the Tudor court records. Mary I's body underwent a 3-day embalming process with full autopsy, as recorded by the royal physician's reports preserved in the National Archives. Even common nobles typically had at least 24 to 48 hours of preparation time. But Elizabeth went from deathbed to sealed coffin in less time than it takes to properly embalm a body using the methods available in 1603. The official explanation from the Privy Council, led by Robert Cecil, was that the Queen had died of natural causes following a long decline, and that rapid sealing was necessary due to the warm spring weather to prevent decomposition. But March in England wasn't exactly tropical. Temperatures averaged around 50 degrees Fahrenheit, hardly warm enough to require emergency preservation measures. The forensic reality tells a different story. Analysis of Tudor-era embalming practices, documented in medical texts like Thomas Vicary's The Anatomy of the Body of Man, published in 1548, shows that proper preservation required removing internal organs, treating the body cavity with preservatives like myrrh and frankincense, and carefully preparing the corpse over several days. This process was not just ceremonial, it was medical. It involved opening the torso, examining organs for signs of disease or poison, removing the heart and viscera for separate burial in some cases, and thoroughly documenting any unusual findings. The Royal College of Physicians had specific protocols for examining deceased monarchs, partly to rule out foul play and partly to maintain detailed medical records of the royal bloodline. Yet none of this happened with Elizabeth. According to the account of Sir Robert Carey, who witnessed the sealing of the coffin, the lead casket was brought to Richmond Palace pre-made, suggesting advance planning. Even more suspicious, the actual transfer of the body into the coffin was done behind closed doors with only 3 people present: Robert Cecil, the Archbishop of Canterbury, John Whitgift, and the Chief Lady of the Bedchamber, Catherine Howard, not to be confused with Henry VIII's executed wife of the same name. No royal physicians, no embalmers, no witnesses from the medical profession who could later testify about what they saw. The physical evidence of this rushed burial still exists today. Elizabeth's tomb in Westminster Abbey contains a lead coffin, weighing approximately 800 pounds, extraordinarily heavy even by Tudor standards. Lead was used for royal burials because it prevented decomposition and sealed in any odors. But the thickness of Elizabeth's coffin, according to architectural surveys of the tomb conducted in the 1960s, exceeds that of other Tudor monarchs buried in Westminster. It's as if they weren't just sealing a body, they were creating a permanent vault that could never be opened without extraordinary effort and authorization. Ground-penetrating radar studies conducted by the Dean and Chapter of Westminster in the 1990s, the results of which remain classified but were partially leaked to historical researchers, supposedly showed unusual density patterns, suggesting the coffin was hermetically sealed with additional internal compartments. Why would you need extra sealing unless you were absolutely terrified of what might be discovered if that coffin was ever opened? The Tudor establishment wasn't just burying a queen, they were burying evidence. And they were making damn sure it stayed buried. To understand what they were hiding, you need to understand what a 1603 autopsy actually involved. And it wasn't the primitive butchery most people imagine. By the early 17th century, anatomical science had advanced considerably beyond medieval practices. The work of Andreas Vesalius, whose groundbreaking De Humani Corporis Fabrica, published in 1543, revolutionized medical understanding, had transformed how physicians viewed the human body. English medical schools, particularly at the University of Cambridge, where many royal physicians trained, taught systematic dissection techniques based on Vesalius's methods. Dr. William Harvey, who would later discover blood circulation, was already practicing medicine in London by 1603 and represented the cutting edge of scientific knowledge. When a Tudor physician performed an autopsy on a person of importance, they knew exactly what to look for and how to document their findings. The procedure, as outlined in medical texts of the period like Helkiah Crook's Microcosmographia, published in 1615, followed a systematic approach. Examination of external features, opening of the torso cavity, inspection of the thoracic organs, examination of the abdominal organs including the reproductive system, and analysis of skeletal structure for abnormalities. The reproductive organ examination was particularly thorough for female nobility because inheritance and legitimacy depended on it. Medical records from autopsies of other royal women, preserved in the Royal College of Physicians archives, showed detailed documentation of the uterus, ovaries, and related structures. When Catherine of Aragon died in 1536, the autopsy specifically noted the condition of her reproductive organs to investigate persistent rumors about her health and fertility. When Catherine Parr, Henry VIII's last wife, died in 1548, physicians examined and documented her uterus and noted signs of recent childbirth. This wasn't prurient interest, it was medical and political necessity. The condition of a queen's reproductive anatomy could answer questions about past pregnancies, potential poisoning, genetic abnormalities, and most importantly, biological sex. Yes, biological sex. Because while it might seem obvious that a woman ruling as queen would be female, the medical reality is that physicians in 1603 were already aware of what we now call intersex conditions. The work of Ambroise Paré, the famous French surgeon whose texts were widely read in England, documented cases of hermaphrodites and individuals whose external appearance didn't match their internal anatomy. Paré's On Monsters and Marvels, published in 1573, described several cases of individuals raised as one sex who were discovered after death to have ambiguous or contradictory sexual anatomy. So when Elizabeth I banned any examination of her body, she wasn't just refusing a formality, she was preventing a forensic investigation that could have revealed anatomical features inconsistent with what everyone assumed about her biology. The level of detail available to a Tudor physician was remarkable. They could measure bone structure and compare it to expected norms for female anatomy. They could examine the pelvis, which in biological females is wider and shaped differently than in males to accommodate childbirth. Measurements that were well understood by 1603. They could inspect for the presence or absence of ovaries, uterus, and other organs expected in a woman who had allegedly menstruated for decades. They could even examine skeletal features like hand size, shoulder width, and jaw structure, all of which show sexual dimorphism that was recognized even in the 17th century. If something was wrong, if the anatomy didn't match the expected female configuration, there would be no hiding it once that body was opened. And that brings us to the terrifying question that haunted Elizabeth's final hours. What would they have found? Contemporary accounts of Elizabeth's physical appearance contain oddities that most historians gloss over, but that take on new significance when examined forensically. The Venetian ambassador Giovanni Scaramelli, who met the Queen in 1603, just months before her death, described her in his official dispatch to the Doge as very tall for a woman, with hands uncommonly large and a voice that carries surprising depth. The French ambassador André Urot described her in 1597 as having shoulders more broad than is common in the feminine sex. These weren't insults, they were diplomatic observations intended to accurately describe the monarch's physical characteristics. Sir John Hayward, a contemporary historian, noted that Elizabeth had a countenance more masculine than might be expected, though cunningly softened by artifice and paint. Even her supporters mentioned unusual features. Sir Robert Cecil himself, in a private letter to James VI of Scotland, preserved in the Cecil Papers at Hatfield House, referred to the aging queen's masculine aspect, which Her Majesty disguises with elaborate costume and cosmetics. The white lead makeup she famously wore, ceruse, a mixture of white lead and vinegar, didn't just cover smallpox scars. It created an artificial face, a mask that could hide bone structure, jawline, and other features that might appear inconsistent with conventional femininity. But the most damning physical evidence comes from analysis of her clothing and the portraits commissioned during her reign. Costume historians examining surviving garments from the Elizabethan wardrobe collections at the Museum of London and Hatfield House have noted peculiarities. The shoulder width of her gowns, the hand measurements indicated by her gloves, and the height requirements of her dresses all suggest physical proportions at the extreme end of the range for biological females, or consistent with a tall, slender male frame. Dr. Janet Arnold, the 20th century costume historian who extensively studied Elizabethan dress, noted in her book Queen Elizabeth's Wardrobe Unlocked that the Queen's clothes showed unusual construction requirements to accommodate a frame that challenged the dressmaker's expectations. The portraits are even more revealing. Elizabeth insisted on controlling her image obsessively in her later years, dictating exactly how artists could paint her. The Mask of Youth portraits from the 1580s and 90s show an increasingly artificial representation. The same ageless face, the same proportions year after year, even as she aged from 50 to 70. Why? Because she couldn't allow realistic portraits that might reveal anatomical features she needed to conceal. Forensic artist analysis of the bone structure visible beneath the painted features in her earlier portraits, compared to the later idealized versions, shows significant discrepancies that suggest deliberate alteration or concealment of masculine facial features like a prominent brow ridge and strong jawline. Then there's the medical history that never made sense. Elizabeth reportedly suffered from what contemporaries called irregularities of the womanly courses, menstruation problems. But the descriptions are vague and contradictory. Some accounts suggest she stopped menstruating in her 30s, others that she had irregular cycles throughout her life. For a woman who lived to 70 years old and whose health was obsessively documented by court physicians, there's a remarkable absence of detailed gynecological records. Compare this to Mary I, whose reproductive troubles were exhaustively documented. Her phantom pregnancies, her desperate hope for an heir, the medical consultations about her fertility. Mary's physicians left detailed records because her ability to produce an heir was crucial. Elizabeth's reproductive health should have been equally documented, especially during the decades when pressure for her to marry and produce an heir was intense. Yet the records are suspiciously sparse. Dr. Christopher Hibbert, a 20th century Tudor historian, noted this oddity, suggesting that either the records were deliberately destroyed or they never existed because there was nothing to record. If Elizabeth's anatomy made menstruation impossible, if there were no ovaries, no uterus, nothing to document, then the absence of records makes perfect sense. The silence speaks louder than any medical report could have. The political implications of anatomical irregularities weren't just scandalous, they were existential threats to the state. Elizabeth's entire claim to the throne rested on being the biological daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. This wasn't just family pride, it was a legal foundation. The Act of Succession passed by Parliament in 1544, after Henry's marriage to Catherine Parr, established the line of inheritance: Edward, then Mary, then Elizabeth. If Elizabeth wasn't actually Henry VIII's biological daughter, if she was a substitute, a replacement, or someone who couldn't possibly have been born from Anne Boleyn's body, then her 45-year reign was illegitimate. Every law she signed, every decision she made, every war she fought would be rendered void. James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England upon Elizabeth's death, claimed the throne through his descent from Margaret Tudor, Henry VIII's sister. His legitimacy derived partly from Elizabeth's endorsement. But if Elizabeth herself was illegitimate, the entire succession became questionable. Catholic powers in Europe had spent decades arguing that Elizabeth was a bastard because Henry VIII's marriage to Anne Boleyn was invalid under Catholic law. If anatomical evidence proved she wasn't even biologically capable of being Anne Boleyn's child, those Catholic arguments would be vindicated in the most spectacular way possible. This is where the Bisley Boy legend enters from folklore into disturbing possibility. The story, dismissed by mainstream historians as Tudor mythology, claims that the real Princess Elizabeth died during her childhood while staying in the village of Bisley in Gloucestershire. According to the legend, Henry VIII was scheduled to visit his daughter, and the terrified guardians, knowing the king's legendary rage, substituted a red-haired boy who resembled Elizabeth rather than admit the princess had died under their care. The boy supposedly continued the impersonation for life, eventually becoming the Virgin Queen who never married, because she couldn't risk the physical intimacy that would reveal the deception. Mainstream historians reject this story as fantasy, pointing to continuity in Elizabeth's life and the impossibility of maintaining such a deception. But forensic historians have noted some intriguing details. There are gaps in the historical record of Elizabeth's childhood between 1544 and 1547, years when she would have been between 11 and 14, precisely when a substitution could have occurred. Thomas Parry, who became Elizabeth's cofferer and closest financial advisor, entered her service in 1547 with suspiciously little background documentation. Catherine Ashley, who became her governess, began her service around the same time. Both were fiercely loyal to Elizabeth throughout their lives, and both took secrets to their graves. More credibly, modern endocrinology offers another explanation that doesn't require conspiracy but still explains the anatomical fears. Androgen Insensitivity Syndrome, or AIS, is a condition where an individual with XY chromosomes develops external female anatomy but lacks a uterus and ovaries, instead having undescended testes. People with complete AIS appear entirely female externally, often strikingly beautiful with clear skin and delicate features, but they don't menstruate and cannot bear children. They typically grow tall with long limbs. The condition was obviously not understood in Tudor times, but it existed. If Elizabeth had complete AIS, she would have been raised as a girl, appeared female, and only realized something was different when she failed to menstruate. This would explain the obsessive control over her body, the absolute refusal to marry despite enormous political pressure, the lack of gynecological records, and most importantly, the terror of post-mortem examination. An autopsy would have revealed testes instead of ovaries, no uterus, and male internal anatomy despite female external appearance. In the 21st century, this is understood as a recognized medical condition. In 1603, it would have been interpreted as demonic possession, divine punishment, or proof of deception. Any of those interpretations would have destroyed her legacy and potentially triggered civil war. The medical evidence they couldn't risk extended beyond reproductive anatomy to skeletal structure and physical features that would have been immediately apparent to Tudor physicians. Dr. William Harvey's work on anatomical examination, though published after Elizabeth's death, reflected practices already in use during her lifetime. Physicians knew that male and female skeletons differed in predictable ways. The pelvis in biological females is wider and has a different angle to accommodate childbirth. This was understood and documented in medical texts. The skull structure differs, with males typically having more prominent brow ridges, larger jaw bones, and different cranial proportions. Limb bones show differences in length ratios and thickness. Hand bones and foot bones exhibit sexual dimorphism that skilled anatomists could recognize. If Elizabeth's skeleton showed predominantly male characteristics, narrow pelvis, robust jaw, long limb bones with male proportions, the examining physicians would have noted it immediately. These weren't subtle differences requiring modern forensic technology. They were obvious to any trained eye that knew what to look for. And Tudor physicians definitely knew what to look for when examining royalty. Contemporary medical understanding of sexual ambiguity was more sophisticated than we give them credit for. Ambroise Paré's surgical texts, widely read by English physicians, included detailed chapters on what he called hermaphrodites, individuals with ambiguous or contradictory sexual characteristics. He described cases of people raised as female who were discovered to have male anatomy internally, and vice versa. He even documented a case from 1560 where a French girl named Marie Le Marcise was raised female but at puberty developed male characteristics, and eventually lived as a man named Marin Le Marcy. The courts and medical authorities of the time conducted examinations and made determinations about true sex based on anatomical evidence. This wasn't theoretical, it was practical medicine. If Elizabeth's body showed similar ambiguities, the examining physicians in 1603 would have had frameworks for understanding and documenting what they found. They would have written reports. Those reports would have been filed with the Privy Council, and those reports would have triggered a constitutional crisis of unprecedented magnitude. The only way to prevent that crisis was to prevent the examination entirely, which is exactly what Elizabeth ordered. There's also the troubling matter of her famous statement, "I know I have the body of a weak, feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king and of a king of England too." This speech, delivered at Tilbury in 1588 before the Spanish Armada invasion, is celebrated as a triumph of rhetoric, Elizabeth claiming masculine courage despite feminine form. But forensic linguists analyzing historical texts have noted the peculiar phrasing. She doesn't say, "I may have a woman's body, but I have a king's courage," which would be straightforward metaphor. She says, "I know I have the body of a weak, feeble woman," as if acknowledging an external perception that might not match reality. The "I know" construction suggests she's aware of how others perceive her body, not how she herself experiences it. The contrast she draws isn't between appearance and character, but between body and heart and stomach, internal organs versus external form. Some historians have suggested this phrasing indicates she was aware of a disconnect between her physical anatomy and her gender presentation. Whether intentional or subconscious, the language hints at a deeper truth about her physical self that she carefully managed throughout her life. And if that truth involved anatomical features that contradicted her public identity as Henry VIII's daughter, the autopsy prohibition becomes not paranoia, but rational self-preservation. The cover-up protocol kicked into action with military precision the moment Elizabeth stopped breathing. Robert Cecil, the Secretary of State and the most powerful man in England, besides the Queen herself, had been planning for this moment for months. Historical documents from the Cecil papers show that he had been in secret communication with James VI of Scotland since at least 1601, preparing for the transition of power. But the transition required careful management of Elizabeth's body and the narrative around her death. Cecil was present in the death chamber along with Archbishop John Whitgift, Admiral Charles Howard, and a handful of the Queen's closest ladies-in-waiting. According to the account of Lady Elizabeth Southwell, who was forced to remain outside the inner chamber, Cecil immediately took charge, issuing orders with an authority that brooked no questioning. The first order was to clear the room of anyone not absolutely essential. The second was to send for the pre-made lead coffin that had been waiting in storage. Yes, waiting. Documentary evidence suggests the coffin had been commissioned weeks earlier, before Elizabeth's final decline, indicating premeditation of this rushed burial. The control extended to information management. On March 24th, within hours of Elizabeth's death, Cecil dispatched riders to key locations throughout England with identical messages announcing the Queen's peaceful death from natural causes and James of Scotland's uncontested succession. These messages, preserved in various county archives, used remarkably similar language, evidence of centralized scripting. At the same time, Cecil ordered the seizure of any documents relating to Elizabeth's medical treatment during her final illness. Dr. John Dee's journals mentioned earlier show a suspicious gap for the period of March 15 through March 25, 1603. Multiple pages were physically removed. The binding shows torn edges. Other physicians who had attended the Queen found their notes confiscated for official records and never returned. Even more tellingly, the royal warrant for the funeral arrangements, signed by Cecil and preserved in the National Archives, included specific language prohibiting any unseemly examination or disturbance of Her Majesty's royal person, and threatening severe punishment for any violation. This wasn't normal funeral protocol language. It was legally binding intimidation designed to prevent anyone from looking too closely. The physical handling of the body reveals perhaps the most damning evidence of concealment. Historical accounts agree that only 3 people directly handled Elizabeth's corpse between death and coffin sealing: 2 senior ladies-in-waiting, Catherine Howard and Philadelphia Carey, and a single male attendant whose name was deliberately not recorded in any official documents. These 3 prepared the body behind locked doors in a chamber that was subsequently stripped, cleaned, and sealed. Again, highly unusual. Standard Tudor protocol involved teams of professional embalmers, physicians, dressmakers preparing the funeral garments, and multiple witnesses to verify proper handling of the royal body. None of that happened with Elizabeth. The clothes she would wear in the coffin were selected beforehand and were deliberately voluminous, according to descriptions in Lady Southwell's letters. Garments of such fullness and elaboration as to disguise all form and shape. Even in death, Elizabeth's body was being hidden beneath layers of fabric. When the coffin was finally sealed, Robert Cecil personally supervised the soldering, and according to the account of the goldsmith Thomas Vautrouillet, Cecil inspected every inch of the seal to ensure it was absolutely airtight. This wasn't grief or ceremony. This was a man making absolutely certain that what was in that coffin would never, ever be examined. So why did the secret have to die with her? Because the alternative was national catastrophe. Put yourself in Robert Cecil's position in March 1603. Elizabeth has just died. You've spent your entire political career building and maintaining the Tudor state. You've secured the succession to James of Scotland through careful diplomacy and secret negotiations. England is finally at peace after decades of war with Spain, religious conflict, and political instability. The economy is recovering. The country is united, more or less. And then imagine what happens if an autopsy reveals that the woman who ruled England for 45 years had male anatomy, or no reproductive organs or physical features that made her biological parentage impossible. The immediate result would be the delegitimization of Elizabeth's entire reign. Every statute she signed, every judicial decision made in her name, every treaty negotiated under her authority, all of it becomes legally questionable. Catholic powers in Europe, especially Spain and the Papal States, would immediately declare that they had been right all along. Elizabeth was a bastard, a pretender, possibly not even a woman. The religious settlement of 1559, which established the Protestant Church of England, could be challenged as invalid. The succession crisis would extend beyond just Elizabeth's legitimacy. James's claim to the English throne rested partly on Elizabeth's endorsement, and partly on his descent from Henry VII through Margaret Tudor. But if the entire Tudor line after Henry VIII was fraudulent, if Elizabeth wasn't who she claimed to be, then were the other heirs legitimate? Questions would arise about Edward VI and Mary I as well. Was there something wrong with all of Henry VIII's children? Was there a genetic condition, a family secret, that explained the strange reproductive failures of all three of his legitimate children? Edward died young and childless. Mary had phantom pregnancies and no living children. Elizabeth never married and had no children. Taken together, these facts suggest something more than coincidence. Perhaps a hereditary condition, perhaps something else entirely. If autopsy evidence revealed anatomical abnormalities in Elizabeth that could be genetic, it would raise terrifying questions about the entire Tudor bloodline. And in an era when royal legitimacy was based on bloodline and divine right, those questions would destabilize not just England, but the entire European political order. The truth is that Elizabeth I was the greatest political operator of her age, and her final command was her last masterpiece of statecraft. She understood that her power had always rested not on military might or wealth, but on image, on the carefully constructed performance of monarchy. She had survived assassination plots, religious conflicts, foreign invasions, and internal rebellions through intelligence, manipulation, and absolute control of her public persona. The white makeup, the elaborate wigs, the jeweled dresses, the ceremonial displays, all of it was theater designed to create an untouchable image of royal authority. She knew that image was more powerful than reality. That perception shaped political possibilities more than facts. And she knew that after death, she would lose control of her image unless she took extraordinary measures. The autopsy prohibition was her final act of control, her ultimate political move. Whatever her body might have revealed, male anatomy, intersex conditions, deformities, or simply the ravages of age that contradicted her public image of eternal majesty, she ensured it would never be discovered. The lead coffin in Westminster Abbey remains sealed more than 400 years later, and short of a government decision to open it for forensic examination, it will likely remain sealed forever. Elizabeth controlled her secret in life through intelligence and force of will. In death, she controlled it through lead, law, and the political necessity of maintaining the stability her reign had created. The Virgin Queen's final virginity was the virginity of her tomb. Eternally unopened, eternally mysterious, eternally beyond the reach of those who would violate her final command. The truth about what Elizabeth I was hiding may never be known with certainty unless modern technology and political will combine to open that lead coffin in Westminster Abbey. But the evidence, the rushed burial, the prohibited autopsy, the anatomical peculiarities noted by contemporaries, the political necessity of concealment, all points to a secret significant enough to threaten the foundation of the English state. Whether she had Androgen Insensitivity Syndrome, whether she was intersex, whether the Bisley Boy legend contained a grain of truth, or whether something else entirely explains her terror of post-mortem examination, we may never know. What we do know is that Elizabeth I, the most powerful woman of her age, feared what would be discovered about her body more than she feared death itself. If this investigation into forbidden royal anatomy fascinated you, subscribe to this channel because we dive deep into historical mysteries that textbooks won't tell you. We bring forensic analysis, scientific evidence, and serious historical research to the stories that deserve more than surface-level treatment. Hit that like button if you appreciate content that treats you like an intelligent adult, capable of handling complex, sometimes disturbing historical realities. And drop a comment telling me what other historical mysteries you want investigated with this level of depth and evidence, because there are plenty more secrets buried in royal tombs, sealed in Vatican archives, and hidden in classified documents waiting to be examined. The past isn't dead. It's just sealed in a lead coffin waiting for someone brave enough to ask the right questions.